The night they brought Sergeant First Class Derek Malone into Hargrove Memorial's trauma bay. He had 4 minutes of viable cardiac output left, and a femoral bleed that had already soaked through 2 field dressings, the paramedic's jacket, and the vinyl of the gurney beneath him. The paramedics came in fast and loud, the way they always do when they know they're losing. Bags swinging. Monitors screaming 2 different alarms at once. One of them was already calling out the blood pressure. 61 over palp. Before the automatic doors had fully opened, and the number landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Most of the night staff heard it and took half a second too long to move. The nurse at the triage station was already moving before they did. Her name was Tessa Harlow. She had worked the overnight shift at Hargrove Memorial for 3 years, and in that time the people around her had formed a collective impression of her that was accurate in its details and completely wrong in its conclusions. She was organized. She was quiet. She did not make conversation during lulls, the way the other nurses did not linger at the coffee station, did not share much about herself beyond the minimum that professional courtesy required. The charge nurse, a broad-shouldered woman named Gloria who had run the overnight floor for 11 years, had described Tessa as the kind of nurse you want next to you in a crisis and can't quite figure out at a birthday party. It was the most perceptive thing anyone at Hargrove Memorial had ever said about Tessa Harlow, and Gloria had said it without understanding how precisely true it was. The attending on call that night was Dr. James Okafor. He was a competent physician and a cautious one, which under most circumstances was exactly what you wanted, and under these circumstances was going to get Sergeant Malone killed. He was reviewing labs at the workstation when the gurney came through. And he assessed the situation in the way that cautious men assess situations, methodically in sequence, and began moving toward the trauma bay with the measured pace of someone who had not yet calculated that there was no time for measured paces. Tessa had already calculated it. She snapped a glove on her right hand with a single practiced motion, called for 2 large bore IVs, and a massive transfusion protocol in a voice that was not loud but carried the specific frequency that makes people in rooms comply, without quite knowing why, and had her hand on Malone's thigh locating the bleed by touch, before the first resident reached the bedside. One of the paramedics started to give her his handoff report. She said, "Keep going," without looking up, meaning she was already working and he should not stop talking. She processed what he said the way certain people process information in emergencies, not sequentially, but all at once, the way a chess player sees the whole board rather than a single piece. Her hands were doing one thing, while her mind was 3 steps ahead of it. The second resident, a young man, 2 months out of his intern year, watched her and felt something he would not be able to describe accurately until years later when he tried to explain it to his own students. He said it was like watching someone shift into a different language. Not a better version of what she normally was. Something else entirely. Dr. Okafor arrived at the bedside. He looked at what Tessa had already done, looked at the monitor, looked at his own hands as if reminding himself they were there. He said, "Good," which was not instruction and not gratitude, just a word that filled the space where words were expected. Tessa did not look up. She said, "I need a vascular surgery consult in this room in 4 minutes, or we're going to lose him on the table." Dr. Okafor made the call, what nobody in that trauma bay stopped to notice. Not the residents, not the paramedics, not Dr. Okafor, not the scrub tech who had arrived late and was still tying his gown. Was the way Tessa Harlow's hands moved through that procedure. Not the speed of them, though the speed was notable. Not the precision, though the precision was the kind that takes years to build. What they missed, because they were not looking for it, was the economy. Every motion she made was stripped of everything unnecessary. There was no hesitation, no adjustment, no momentary reaching for the next thought. It was the movement of someone who had built these actions into the deepest architecture of their body. The kind of muscle memory that does not come from hospital simulations or skills lab mannequins. The kind that comes from doing this without a cart, without overhead lighting, without the ambient noise of a functioning institution around you. The kind that comes from doing this in conditions where the next sound you heard might be the last one, and every second you spent second-guessing yourself was a second somebody else paid for. 3 men had come in with Sergeant Malone. They sat in the family waiting area in civilian clothes that did not sit on them, the way civilian clothes sit on most people. The fabric was organcy. The posture was not. They occupied their chairs the way people who have been trained in enclosed spaces occupies chairs, backs to the wall, sightlines to the door, weight distributed in a way that would allow them to move fast. The one nearest the hallway entrance had not looked at his phone since they arrived. He was watching the double doors to the trauma bay, the way a person watches something they have decided not to look away from. His name was Staff Sergeant Roy Kimball. He had been in the unit for 11 years. He had worked alongside attachments from programs that did not appear on organizational charts and support personnel, whose names he had been specifically instructed not to write down or repeat. He had, over those 11 years, developed a particular kind of attention. The kind that runs constantly in the background, cataloging, filing, cross-referencing without conscious effort. The way a trained ear hears pitch without trying to. When the trauma bay doors swung open briefly at the 30-minute mark, and he caught 2.5 seconds of the room inside. Staff Sergeant Kimball filed one detail without deciding to. The nurse's left forearm. The way her sleeve had ridden up when she reached across the patient at full extension. A mark on the inside of her wrist, small, dark. Geometric in a way that was not decorative, not the kind of thing that comes from a parlor on a Friday night, or a flash sheet on a wall. A specific configuration of lines that carried, to the untrained eye, no particular meaning. To Roy Kimball's eye, it carried considerable meaning. He had seen that mark twice before in his career. Once on a contractor who had been embedded with his unit for 6 days. During an operation in a country he was not going to name, who had disappeared on the 7th day without a word to anyone. Whose name had not appeared in any after-action report he was given access to. Once on a photograph, a single photograph in a briefing he had attended, presented without context, referenced by a designation rather than a name, explained only as coordination asset theater level. Both times he had been told, explicitly and without elaboration, not to ask follow-up questions. He looked at the floor. He breathed steadily, the way he had been trained to breathe in situations that required him to appear calm while his mind ran hard. He looked at his teammate across the room. A quiet, heavy-set man named Corporal James Sutton, who had a gift for reading Kimball's face that Kimball had long since stopped trying to obscure, and gave the smallest nod. Not a nod that said anything specific. A nod that said, "I've seen something. Sit with it." Sutton's expression did not change. He looked back at the doors. They both sat with it. The waiting area filled and thinned around them the way hospital waiting areas do at 3 in the morning. A woman with a sleeping child. An elderly man who kept asking the front desk the same question. 2 college-age kids who were either very worried or very tired or both. None of them looked at Kimball or Sutton. None of them would have known what they were looking at if they had. Tessa Harlow did not look at the waiting area at all. She had learned a long time ago not to look. The thing about fieldwork, real fieldwork, the kind that doesn't get written up in official histories or featured in recruitment materials, is that it teaches you to manage your gaze the way a magician manages attention. You look where you need to look. You do not look at the things that are better left unacknowledged. You develop a peripheral awareness so refined that you can track everything in a room, without appearing to track anything at all. Tessa Harlow had not needed that skill in 3 years. She had not used it consciously, since the day she submitted her paperwork and walked away from the work, and rebuilt herself into the kind of person who spent her nights stabilizing strangers, and her days in a quiet apartment near the hospital with a cat named Biscuit and no pictures on the walls. She had needed it tonight. She had clocked the 3 men in the waiting area before the gurney was through the doors. Not because she recognized them, because of the way they sat. She had filed it. She had continued working. She had saved Sergeant Malone's life. By 2 in the morning he was out of immediate danger. The vascular surgeon, Dr. Patricia Huang, had arrived in time and performed a repair that she later described to her colleagues as among the cleaner cases she had managed under pressure. The ICU team that received Malone commented that whoever had handled the initial stabilization had bought him a window that most patients in his condition were not given. They said it with professional admiration. Nobody asked who specifically they meant. Tessa charted her notes with the same precision she brought to everything. She noted the interventions in the sequence they occurred. The patient's response at each stage, the timing of the vascular consult, the blood products administered. She did not note what the stabilization had felt like from the inside. the particular quality of focus that descended over her. When the gurney came through, the way her hands moved before her mind had consciously told them to. The decade of something she had tried to leave behind surfacing cleanly, automatically, without ceremony, like a language you stop speaking but never stop knowing. She clocked back to the floor at 2:15. Roy Kimball had not slept. He had not expected to. He sat in the family waiting area while the room gradually emptied around him, and he spent the time the way he always spent time when something didn't fit, working it from every angle, testing every explanation against what he actually knew, eliminating the ones that required him to dismiss data he had no reason to dismiss. The tattoo was not dismissible. He was not a man who invented significance. He was a man who, over 11 years of work that required him to notice things other people missed, had developed a very low tolerance for coincidence and a very high tolerance for uncomfortable conclusions. At 3:40 in the morning, he pulled out his phone. He opened an encrypted channel his unit used for non-operational communication. He typed carefully, the way he always typed when the subject matter was adjacent to things that had been explicitly categorized. He wrote, "Anyone have intel on the overnight nursing staff at Hargrove Memorial?" Looking at a female, dark hair, roughly mid-30s, left wrist. He did not type the mark. "You did not put the mark in writing." "Not in any format," he added. "You'll understand the reference if you've had the briefing." He put the phone face down on his knee and waited. The reply came in 53 minutes. It came from a contact who held a rank Kimball would not say out loud in mixed company, through a channel that, if anyone had been monitoring it, would have appeared to be a mundane scheduling exchange. It said 3 things: confirmed asset, retired non-operational status, voluntary, do not approach, do not reference, do not acknowledge, note for your own records only. The program takes care of its people. She chose to take care of herself. Kimball read it 3 times. Then he set the phone on the seat beside him and looked at the ceiling and sat with what he now knew and what it meant about the last 2 hours. He thought about Malone on that table. He thought about 61 over palp. He thought about 4 minutes of viable cardiac output and a nurse who had been in motion before the doors finished opening, whose hands had moved with the specific economy of who had done harder versions of this in places that would never be named, who had then walked back to her station and continued her shift, as if none of it had been anything other than ordinary. He thought about what it costs a person to carry that and make it look like nothing. At 6 in the morning, shift change began. Tessa Harlow moved through the unit handoff with the same deliberate efficiency, saw to everything. She had given her last patient update and was crossing toward the elevator's bank when she became aware, without appearing to become aware, that one of the men from the waiting area had stood up. She stopped, not because she was startled, because she had been calculating since 2:15 whether this moment would come, and had not been able to determine the answer with enough certainty to plan for it, and now it had arrived, and she needed a half-second to decide how to meet it. Roy Kimball was not a man who performed emotion. He said the thing he had decided to say, which was the only true thing he knew how to offer. "You brought my sergeant back." Tessa looked at him. Not the way most civilians look at soldiers, with the particular cocktail of admiration and discomfort, and performed gratitude that people produce when they don't know what else to do. Not with any of the stock responses. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person who is standing at the edge of a line, and she was running a very fast calculation about exactly how close to that line he was actually standing, and what the appropriate response was to his proximity. She said, "He fought hard. I just didn't let him quit." Kimball nodded. He let 2 seconds pass. Then he said quietly, and without looking at her wrist, and without gesturing in any direction, "My contact sends his regards. He said to tell you, some doors stay open, even when you stop using them." The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. Tessa Harlow went very still. It was a particular kind of stillness. Not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of a person recalibrating to a frequency they had not expected to hear again. A frequency they had, in fact, spent 3 years very deliberately moving away from. Her face did not change in any way that the other people in the hallway would have noticed. Kimball was not other people. He saw the thing that moved through her expression. Not fear, not guilt, not relief, not anger. Something older than any of those. The particular weight of a person who had given something enormous, had not been asked to account for it, had simply been thanked and dismissed, and left to find their own way back to ordinary life, and who had done so quietly and completely, only to have that life intersect with the old one at 6 in the morning, in a hospital corridor that smelled like floor wax and coffee. She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it appeared to. Then she said, "Tell him the door was always open. I just decided I didn't need to walk through it anymore." She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. She walked toward the exit. The morning light was coming in through the hospital's east-facing glass and it caught her as she pushed through the door. The winter kind of light, pale and specific and without warmth. The kind that shows you exactly what's there and softens nothing. For one moment, as her arm extended to push the door open, the inside of her left wrist was visible, the mark clear, dark and deliberate and geometrically precise, and carrying the full weight of a history that no personnel file, no after-action summary, no officially declassified document would ever fully hold. Then she was through the door and the light took her and she was gone. Kimball stood where he was. Behind him, Corporal Sutton exhaled slowly through his nose, the quiet exhale of a man who has been holding something for a long time, and is only now allowing himself to set it down. Neither of them spoke for a while. There are people who serve in ways the country never publicly accounts for, who take their training and their silence and their particular way of moving through a crisis into ordinary rooms. Hospital corridors, school hallways, grocery stores, the cab of a truck at 2 in the morning. And who do the work when the work presents itself without announcement, without the apparatus of their former life around them, with nothing but what was built into them over years, that cost more than most people are ever asked to pay. They don't wear the old rank. They don't carry the old ID. They carry the marks sometimes if they chose to keep it. And they carry the other things. The reflex, the economy of motion, the particular clarity that descends when everything else dissolves and there is only the problem in front of them and what needs to happen next. Tessa Harlow walked out into the morning. She had a shift again in 14 hours. She had a cat that would want his breakfast, and a coat that wasn't quite warm enough for the weather, and a route home. She had walked 300 times and knew without thinking. She had a life that was quiet and deliberate and genuinely hers, built from the ground up after everything that came before it. And she had never once asked for credit for what she had traded to be standing in it. She was just a nurse. She had chosen to be just a nurse. And in that choice, in the full weight of everything it contained, and everything it cost and everything it quietly, permanently made possible, was the most complete kind of strength that Roy Kimball, in 11 years of working alongside some of the most capable peoples his country had ever produced, had ever had the privilege of witnessing. Subscribe to The Secret Nurse, because the people who ask for nothing are the ones this channel exists for. The next story is already waiting. And it will ask you the same question this one did. How much can a person carry? And how quietly can they carry it?